Today I'd like to think about quite a complicated process, which is the relationship between spirituality and altered states of mind. I'd like to say from the very beginning that I think spirituality in essence, which is to do with self-awareness, the one mind or emptiness, is very different from altered states of mind which involve the psyche. So that you could say we all experience an altered state of mind when we dream. And you could include a certain kind of altered state as using the imagination. So you could use your imagination and visualize certain images that you see in your mind, which would be like apparitions or hallucinations or something like that. Or you could use the Jungian method of active imagination and see an image and then go into your psyche in an out of the body experience. I've never done anything like that. I've never gone out of my body. I've never lost my consciousness and gone into an altered state of mind. So that's never been a part of my spiritual understanding. And yet I've studied mythology and religion and mysticism, symbols, in depth, gone right into it, read the books, etc. And I've had dreams and I've had visions, but that they naturally occurred in the evening. So when I went to bed, I could dream or have a vision. And in the room, while I'm in bed, I can see all kinds of apparitions. So I've seen what you might call demonic looking faces or entities. I've seen very beautiful godlike images. I've seen hundreds of people lined up in rows, dressed in grey robes, reminding me of Hades, the Greek underworld, where the shades of the souls of the dead are waiting to go across the river Styx into the underworld. And you can only be ferried over the river Styx if you've actually died. I've seen dolphins, very big dolphins, swimming around the room. I've seen UFO type objects, very strange objects. I've seen two entities that appeared in the room, so that when I woke up in the middle of the night, I immediately opened my eyes and I could see these two entities. And as soon as I saw them, they disappeared through the door. I've been in very deep sleep and I've seen this black object with white script around it. I've immediately woken up in bed, opened my eyes, and that same object is in the room. So I saw it in my psyche and I saw it in the room. So pretty much I've seen every kind of apparition, you might say, and I just see ordinary people wandering around in the room, and they seem to walk right through me in the bed, you know, and they're hanging around me in the bed, so they're like surrounding me. But I've never heard any of these entities ever speak to me. I've never had a telepathic message, I've never had no sound, no audible sound. And none of that would I call an altered state of mind. I'm saying that a dream and a vision, hallucination, they are altered states of mind. But what I mean by altered states of mind is when you actually leave your body, in and out of the body, and you go into your psyche. Well, I've never done that. So I've never felt that any form of meditation, any form of out of the body, altered state, has anything to do with my spiritual process, which began at the age of 23. So I've never belonged to anything, I've never followed anything, and the only thing I did get involved in was going to listen to Krishnamurti talking every year from 71 to 85 in England, Brockwood Park, Hampshire. And I enjoyed meeting the people from all over the world and talking about things. And through relating to Krishnamurti, sitting near him at the table, talking to him, I've had several experiences that I would say were related to him personally. So whatever Krishnamurti was involved in his spiritual life, I became involved in that with him, so that I can say that I've had experiences that probably he had. Maybe we shared them, maybe my experiences reflect his own experiences. When I was living in Oxford in the 1980s, I was staying with my friend, who's my best friend, and he had been at Oxford University studying classics at Exeter College when I met him, and I was giving a workshop on consciousness, and then we did a workshop on synchronicity. And he went on to become a Jungian scholar, and he's probably the most significant academic scholar on Jung and synchronicity in the world. So I've known him for 32 years. So I met him in 1986. 1985. So what happened was, 1985 was the year before Krishnamurti died. So he was giving his last talk at Brockwood Park, and I was there, and I was standing near the principal of the school, Dorothy Simmons, and I was a friend of Dorothy Simmons. And I was just standing there while Krishnamurti was talking. And I noticed a couple of young men. I was probably, I was 40 at the time. And these two young men, they seemed, I thought they might be brothers, and they were in their early 20s. And I was really looking from behind, so I just saw the back of their heads. But I saw them when they got up, and I just saw their faces. But while he was talking and they were sitting there, I just had the very strong image while I was looking at one of the men, looking at the back of his head, that he was very intelligent. I just had that thought that he was very intelligent. So I didn't think anything more. I didn't see them afterwards, and I stayed for a number of days at the conference, and then went back to Oxford. So Brockwood Park, Hampshire, is about 70 miles from Oxford. So I go back to Oxford and I'm standing in my house looking out at the street, and the man I saw at Brockwood, he rode by on a bicycle, and I thought that was interesting. And I was friends of this person who was the director of the Rudolf Steiner Center. And I said to him I'd like to give a workshop in the Friends Meeting House on consciousness. So I made some posters and put them around a bit, and I was going down the high street of Oxford to put a poster up, and I saw this man again, this young man. And I went up to him and I said, "Oh, I'm giving a conference on consciousness, and I saw you at the Krishnamurti conference. Would you like to come?" And when I gave the workshop, he turned up. We became very good friends. Now, we were living we shared a house in Walton Street in Jericho, Oxford, which is just next to the city. And if you walk down Walton Street, you come to the Clarendon Press, which is the Oxford University Press. And then you can go to Walton Wells Street that goes down towards the Thames River. And right next to the Thames River is this huge meadow. It's a flat meadow where a lot of horses are grazing, and it's a public meadow, and it's huge space, probably a mile by half a mile. So we were walking down one time over the railway, over the canal bridge towards the meadow, and I said to my friend, I can't go any further. I just felt this intense energy in the sky. So what it felt like was an invisible magnetic energy that I thought was in the sky, in the space around me. And I literally had to bend over. I had to like kneel down on the floor. It was so powerful. I said, I can't go any further. If I do, I'm going to lose my consciousness. It was very, very powerful. And that happened a couple of times. And then one time when we were down in the meadow, I said, look at the clouds. And right above us, all the clouds were in a square formation. They're all like squares, and I've never ever seen that before. And the whole sky above us was like a whole series of square clouds. And as I looked over towards the west, towards the northwest, I saw this big head of an eagle in the clouds. Huge head of an eagle, and I immediately thought of Krishnamurti's book, The Flight of the Eagle, and I really associated that experience, those experiences, with what Krishnamurti calls immensity, this energy that has this sense of immensity. And he talks about when he's out walking that he has to turn back because the energy is so powerful that he would either lose his consciousness, which he went back to the house and lost his consciousness, or he would feel that he would lose all sense of consciousness and just keep on walking and forget where he's going and get lost, as it were. Just in a sense, he would have no sense of direction or no sense of memory. Now that's happened to me quite a few times. I mean, that's quite normal when I'm around the house or I'm out walking. I can actually be like that. and I've been like that for many years. So another time, I'm on my own, living in this house. Before I met my friend, this was in 1984. So I'm living in Jericho, not far from where we were living, and St. John's Street and Pusey Street, near St. Giles Avenue, right next to the Ashmolean Museum. And I'm in my room, I'm sitting in the chair looking out of the window, and it's a garret on top of on the roof. So I'm looking out across Worcester College and to the hill. There's a hill that goes from in the west from the north to the south, and it's just a line of hills that creates the valley in which Oxford City is. And Oxford City itself is surrounded by the Thames River and the Cherwell River. So I'm sitting there and just being quiet, and I sense this energy again. This energy beyond the hill. It's like as if that energy is beyond the hill. So I'm looking at the hills. It's in the afternoon, and I feel this energy gripping my attention, and as if it's coming over the hill. So it's like this immensity, you might say, almost like a tidal wave of energy filling the whole sky. So we're talking about an energy that's filling the whole sky, and as if it's coming over the hill towards the house. And it just has this very powerful sense. So you can imagine, like, say, an animal. If an animal there's a storm, and the animal becomes alert about the storm, and there's a great apprehension that the storm is getting closer and closer. Well, that's exactly how it felt. It's like your whole organism, your whole body and mind is alert to something very powerful that might take you over in a way. It's like very powerful. And it's like coming across from the hills towards me, filling the whole space of the sky. And I feel almost as that if this energy comes right up to me in the house, I would be knocked unconscious, as it were. So I kind of stopped the process. The process happened on its own, but I got up, and I don't know, how can I say, it's like I just switched off from paying attention, and it didn't affect me, so everything was all right. So again, it's that very powerful energy that seems to fill the whole space of the sky. So I assume it's what Krishnamurti calls the immensity. And he also says that's a form of universal mind. So the universal mind, he says, is the source of creation. It's beyond, as it were, the physical universe and beyond the matter and energy of the universe. So Krishnamurti doesn't talk about a psyche, he doesn't talk about a spiritual dimension. So when he's talking to Professor Bowen, all he talks about is the physical universe. He says that consciousness, that means psyche, consciousness, dreams, all of that, is part of the brain. So he says consciousness and thought, psyche, is actually part of the material brain. And he said that this universal mind is where he is. He's actually in that universal mind, but he's not a personality. He's not Krishnamurti. That's part of the memory consciousness, but he's in this universal mind, and this universal energy and mind is not connected to the body, is separate from the body, but he can speak through the body. So I would say that I haven't gone into that universal mind. I haven't left my body and gone into that universal mind. Whatever that power is, that energy, I've never gone into it. And I see that as an altered state. I think that's the psyche, and that's an altered state. And Krishnamurti said that the self is the same as the ego in consciousness. So that he says, in the universal mind, there is no Krishnamurti, there is no self. So that would indicate to me that it's a form of altered state. Whereas for me, the spiritual nature of the mind, the one mind in Tibetan Buddhism, what's called emptiness, and Krishnamurti calls the universal mind emptiness. So I would say the emptiness of nirvana, or the one mind, isn't an energy. It's not an energy. It's not a power. It's not an immensity. It's not an expansion. It's not cosmic consciousness, which he says that's another form of cosmic consciousness. So I'm saying what Krishnamurti is experiencing is an altered state, and it's not the emptiness of nirvana, of the one mind, which has no conditions, no energy, it's just pure emptiness. So when I sit here now, the emptiness I'm experiencing now in the self-aware state, or the spiritual dimension, has no energy, no power, it's pure emptiness. So in the room here now, the light and the space in the room is literally empty. There's no like energy, there's no sense of energy, there's no sense of presence, there's no sense of conditions, there's no sense of anything really. So it's not of the one mind, the emptiness isn't a vastness, it's not an immensity, it has nothing to describe, there's no description, and it's silence, it's stillness, it's wholeness, it's oneness, and it's nothing. It has no action. It's not like I can act on anything from this one mind, from this. I can't act on anything. I can't act on my body. I can't act on my consciousness. I can't act on the world around me, because I can't do it. I can't do anything because it's nothing. You can't work with it because it's nothing. It's empty. So that, as I say, it's not a state. And Krishnamurti does refer to the universal mind as a state. So I would say that the real emptiness, as it were, has no way of acting, has no way of affecting anything, has no way of moving, of doing, or anything like that. So I'll give another connection with Krishnamurti. So I'm at the school, Brockwood Park, it's the very end of the conference, and this is probably in the early 80s. And I stay to the end of the conference, I'm living in the house, I'm probably saying goodbye to Dorothy Simmons, the principal. There's a few people in the house, so I start to leave, and I'm going past the Oast house, and I hear somebody say goodbye, and I look over and it's Krishnamurti, and I say goodbye. And at that moment, my voice was his voice, my voice and his voice. It was like an echo, as if the energy and the vibration of me saying goodbye and him saying goodbye, it was on the same level. It was like he was me and I was him. There was an absolute unity, like a mirror reflection. So I leave the school, I go down and catch the bus to Winchester, and I get on a coach in Winchester to go back to Oxford through the Vale of the White Horse. So it's about a 60-mile journey. So I'm on the coach, I'm sitting next to the driver at the very front of the coach, and I think it's beginning to get dark, so it's a kind of like sunset. And suddenly I'm in another dimension. So I'm sitting in the coach. I have consciousness. I'm just sitting there looking out, and suddenly everything I'm seeing changes. So it's the same world. I'm just looking at the valley, looking at the trees in the coach. Nothing has changed in my body, nothing has changed in my consciousness. But in my mind, spiritually in my mind, it's as if the whole world has changed into something, I would say, like a paradise. It's like a very it was very beautiful, otherworldly paradise, and yet everything was normal. Nothing changed, no change in my consciousness, no change in my body, no change in any energy or anything. It was absolutely like unimaginable. So I link that to Krishnamurti, and again I think it was an altered state of mind. Now it's interesting that Krishnamurti wrote in his notebook or his journal in the 60s and 70s, he wrote that he was somewhere walking along and there was an old lady, and he was noticing the old lady and how she had lived her life, and a life of suffering, and she's very old and everything. And he said he was walking near her and he entered her body. He said he went into her body, and I think he said he could look out of her eyes. So I'm wondering whether Krishnamurti could transfer or do something to me and enter into my psyche and create that altered state. I don't know, I think that's what happened. I don't know how it happened, but I think that Krishnamurti possibly could do that, come into my body or into my psyche in some way and change my perception into an altered state. You know, it's just like if you're lying in bed and you fall asleep and you're in this beautiful dream, it's only a fraction of a second and you're in this beautiful dream. So I'm saying it was just like suddenly, within a fraction of a second that had no effect, I was suddenly in this other dimension, altered state. So that's why I say that Krishnamurti's experience is like the one mind, and he uses the language of the one mind in Tibetan Buddhism, so to speak, universal mind, but I don't think it is that. I don't think his experience of it is that. He's describing the emptiness, but he gives it the form of expansion, he gives it the form of vastness, he gives it the form of energy, etc. And it's related to the physical universe in some way. Whereas I think the mind, it's certainly in the Buddhist sense, is actually not connected to the physical universe, is not connected to the psyche. And I think the psyche, like Carl Jung says, I think the psyche is separate from the body, whereas he says the psyche and consciousness is a material process in the brain, basically a process of thought. But I think the thought and consciousness is the psyche, and that's where you have psychic experiences, that's where you have altered states. And in a conversation with Professor Boehm, he said that he can go into a clairvoyant state, he can telepathically read people's minds, and he can heal. He said he did a lot of healing. Now they're psychic abilities, and they're also to do with mediumism. Now mediumism, if you go into a trance, you can lose consciousness, and Krishnamurti does talk about losing consciousness. And in the trance, if you're a medium, you can speak through your body but not be awake. Now people that have looked after Krishnamurti after he's lost consciousness, they say that somebody spoke through his body and said that they've taken him away and they're looking after him. So it seems like he's connected to some kind of entities or beings that are looking after him. Now Krishnamurti also said that all of his life he felt protected. So he feels, in whatever way that he feels he's protected. I've never felt protected. I've never ever felt protected by anything. So again, I think he was brought up as a Brahmin in Hinduism. His father was a Brahmin in Hinduism, and his father belonged to the Theosophical Society, and he became part of the Theosophical Society, and he was groomed as the world teacher, as the Buddha Maitreya. And he had, when he was young, had lots of visions of the Buddha and different things like that, and would lose his consciousness. So again, I see that as an altered state. He's got psychic abilities, and this idea of being protected is very typical of various religions, where they say the saints or your spiritual guru on some other level, or in Theosophy they say the masters and various people look after you. You're protected because you're a special person. You have a special mission on the earth, and so you're looked after. Well, I've never ever felt that, and I think that's because I don't see my spiritual life having anything to do with the psyche or the gods or entities or anything like that. And I've never lost my consciousness, and I've never been mediumistic. Even though I've inherited a psychic ability, I do have certain psychic things do happen to me, but I'm not really concerned with those. I've never been interested, and if I could heal, I wouldn't practice healing or anything like that. I'm not interested in any psychic ability. And I'd like to talk about something very, very serious and very, very powerful. And this will involve myself and Krishnamurti, not in relationship, but just looking at Krishnamurti. I had my change of consciousness where I became self-aware. That means I became spiritually aware. of the one mind. That was in 1923, after I'd left university. And that happened naturally. I didn't do anything, that just happened completely naturally. And I've been self-aware in the one mind for 50 years. And I never told anybody. In fact, I've only told one person in my whole life, and that's my best friend, who's a Jungian scholar. Now, when I grew up, I would say that I had no psychological problems with my family or my friends or the world. I had no psychological problems. I was very fit. I was always fit. I'd never got ill. I was very independent, very composed. I was quiet. I never read books. My first book I read was at the age of 19. I never watched television, never listened to the radio. I didn't collect records. I used to walk in nature, and I used to like going into Oxford to the museums and the colleges and walking around the rivers. That's how I spent my childhood. So I didn't belong to anything, didn't collect anything. There was no religion in the house, no politics, nothing. So I was very free. I was left in a very free state. And I was well behaved, so my parents never told me what to do. And I never experienced what you might call fear. I never had any, as I say, psychological problems, and I never had any real sense of fear about anything. And in terms of being brought up without religion, so I had no sense of anything other than this world we live in. I didn't know anything about dying and continuing after death or anything like that, or about the idea of a soul, about an interior life and visions and all of that stuff, the saints and Christ and God. None of that had any meaning to me. So I had absolutely no idea of what religion and spirituality meant. So I've left university where I studied philosophy and comparative religion. I'm living alone in a city called Poughkeepsie, which is on the Hudson River north of New York City in America. So I'm on my own. I don't know anybody. And I have this change of consciousness. So I'm saying the change of consciousness because I'll describe it before I read any books on spirituality. So I had no language to describe it. So something very dramatic, something very powerful, something very disturbing began to happen to me. And as I said before that, I'd never been disturbed psychologically, emotionally, or anything like that. There was no interior depth. There was no interior sense of myself. And I was never a psychological person, so I never thought about myself. I never analysed myself. And I was never self-conscious. I never had I was always quite free and independent and never worried about what people thought or anything like that. So this shift of consciousness, so there's something dramatic, something disturbing, and very, very negative. There's this negative, disturbing, deep, very deep, and I'm saying the word deep. I mean, I wouldn't have used the word deep at the time, but I didn't know what it was, and I had no idea of a mind. So all I knew was that, I was only physically aware. I wasn't aware of a mind or a consciousness or a soul. I was just physical. I was just living in a physical world, and I was just physical, and you'll live and you'll die. So there's no sense of interior or anything like that. So obviously I thought it was something wrong with my body. So I went to the doctor, and I forget what I said to the doctor, but nothing happened. So I kind of lived with this kind of disturbance, very dark disturbance. And it was what I would call a kind of breakdown. It was like a kind of psychosis, in the sense it was a very dark, shocking, traumatic disturbance. And I lived with that for many weeks, and it made me suicidal. It was very, very dark, very, very like dangerous. You know, it's like extremely dangerous state to be in, very dangerous. And I say that the world around me, the world around me became quite different. It became quite different. And it had a certain kind of ambience, a certain kind of presence or numinosity, a kind of just very, very strange. Everything was normal, but it felt very strange. And I adapted to that, and I quite liked it, even though there was a kind of quite a deep level of disturbance. I still I was enjoying my daily life. And I just began doing things, going places and meeting people that I wouldn't have met before. So I'd be somewhere and meet somebody, and I knew that they weren't the kind of people that I would mix with before. And then I met this girl, and we had a relationship. And it was like not only romantic, but quite poetic. It was very poetic, and I was writing poetry at the time as well. But it was like, again, this numinous presence in the world was making the world very poetic, very romantic, very poetic. And then I stopped going out with her, and she was the kind of girl, she was a model from New York, an Irish American girl, very beautiful, pre-Raphaelite, and I met this girl, another girl, but she was very light. The other one was a bit dark and shadowy in a way, very romantic. And of course the romantics and the pre-Raphaelites and the romantics, they were very dramatic, very gothic, like a kind of shadowy world. But this new girl I met, she was very bright, very the opposite. And my life changed from a very shadowy, disturbing, dark, foreboding kind of sense of myself in the world to a very liberated state. I became what I call enlightened. I gained my self-awareness, and I felt the word that came to me, the word that I used, was freedom. So this coming out of this dark night of the soul, as it were, this kind of melancholic state of the romantic, as it were, I just felt absolutely liberated, not from that state. It was a kind of freedom in itself. There was no effect from the past. I didn't look back at the past. I completely forgot the traumatic shock, and I just was free. And this girl seemed to reflect that, the girl I was going going with seem to reflect that. And so the state of mind I'm in now, not the state of mind, but the one mind and the self-awareness I have now, which is absolute freedom, that's what came to me. So I was absolutely free. But in my consciousness, I was just behaving normally, interacting with people, going out with girls, going dancing and different things. My consciousness was absolutely normal. And I've never tried to change my consciousness. I've never found a problem with my consciousness, my thinking, my behaviour, and all of that. Whereas Krishnamurti spent his whole life thinking that consciousness and thought and ego and self were the problem that was blocking spiritual insight, spiritual liberation. Well, I feel very different from that. I think the way the world's going and history and culture, I think it's perfectly all right. I think it works itself out. I don't find a problem with conditioning, with thought and consciousness. And I don't think that has anything to do with the spiritual awakening. I think the spiritual is something in itself. I think it works in its own way. It's not about the state of your body and the state of your psyche and altered states and so forth and so on. So I've never analysed myself, I've never worked on myself, I've never tried to communicate to other people that they should or shouldn't be in a state of freedom. I just leave people alone to live their life, and I would never try to influence them or think that I could talk them into this liberated state. I don't think you can do that. So I'm 100% different from Krishnamurti, that thinks you can talk to people, that in some way you can awaken some kind of response in people. I don't think you can. And because the mind is nothing, is really empty, there is no action. There is no way you can do anything to consciousness and the body. There's no influence. It's got nothing to do with psychic abilities. It's got nothing to do with energy. It's got nothing to do with that. Now, if I could affect the world with the mind, then it would do that on its own. I don't have control over the mind. The mind will do what it does. And because the mind, as I see it, is not only what I'm aware of, but the mind is really is integral to the world we live in. The mind, the emptiness, enfolds the physical universe and the psychic dimension. And what I'm thinking is that the one is with everybody all their life. The one is everywhere because it's emptiness. It's actually not only enfolding the space of the universe, but it permeates the universe. So you might say the whole of the physical universe and the whole of the psyche is enfolded in this one mind, in this space. So I see each person as having a self, and that self is there in their life, but most people get that conflated with the ego in their consciousness. They're so identified with their consciousness and their ego that they're not directly aware of the self. But when you become awakened to yourself, then you see the distinction between self-awareness and ego consciousness. Whereas Krishnamurti said self is ego, which is what Freud believed, who was a materialist. It's a very materialistic view that self and consciousness are part of the brain. Whereas Carl Jung thought the consciousness and the self was part of the psyche. whereas I see the self as part of the spiritual dimension, so that when Buddha went into nirvana, he became his true self, he became a true individual, which means indivisible. And in Zen they say when you enter the emptiness of Satori, enlightenment, you discover your self-nature, which is always there with you, but you're in ignorance of it because you're clouded by your consciousness or the veil of Maya. So consciousness is the veil of Maya in which self-deception takes place, because the ego is not the self. So the ego, you might say, in the center of consciousness, like the spider in the center of the web of Maya, prevents you from being free. And the only way you can free yourself from that illusion is to be awakened by the mind. And the mind, as I say, isn't under the control of consciousness, so you can't do anything about it. You can't practice meditation. You can't literally do anything about it. So if it comes into your life, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And when you're in the mind, self-aware, there's nothing you can do about the world. There's nothing you can do at all about the world from that point of view. However, there are spiritual perceptions that come with the one mind, and they are spiritual perceptions of compassion and love, for example, or discriminating wisdom. Now, again, like the mind, they act on their own. So if I'm sitting here and I feel compassion for the world, if I have an awareness of the world, and you might say the suffering of the world, or the struggle in the world, or the conflict in the world. Now, if I sense in myself compassion, which is a spiritual perception, which is holistic, I don't know what that's doing. I don't know if it's doing anything or not. But all I know is I can be, at certain times, I know that I'm in this condition or state of compassion. And so I don't know whether it has any effect in the world or how the mind works in the world, but I'm absolutely sure that the mind does work in the world, and I think the mind brings about enlightenment and the liberation of the self from consciousness. But I have no idea how it works. Now, when I say the one mind, in my own case, I'm talking about something immanent. I'm not talking about something transcendent, outside of the body and outside of the psyche. But when you're in this spiritual mind or dimension, by implication, you're not in your body and you're not in your psyche. So as I sit here, although I'm aware of my body, aware of my consciousness, and aware of myself, they're all one thing. I don't separate them. They're all one thing. Now, the Buddha is said to have left his body and gone into a transcendental dimension of the one mind. So I see the mind as being immanent in my own case, but also if I left my body, I maybe could go into a transcendental state of the one mind. I think that's true. Now, going to a more serious level, as I said before, now, when I said there was a deep, dark disturbance, when I started to read the spiritual texts, especially Tibetan Buddhism, I discovered the concept of the void. And that sense of the void was what I was going through, what I call the dark night of the soul, what they call going into the underworld. And so you're touching something at a very deep level called the void. Now, I think the void isn't the body and it's not the psyche. So I think the void is when you become aware of something very powerful. So when I went through this experience or process, I became aware of a very dark, dramatic, dangerous, you might say, presence. And I felt that it was very challenging to my consciousness, to my identity, to my ego. I felt it to be overwhelming, very powerful. But I didn't lose consciousness, and I lived with it for many weeks. And I didn't go away from it, I just lived with it, very difficult. And I've always faced things. I've never escaped from painful experiences and aspects of suffering. I've never escaped from those things. I always face them rather than go to the doctors and medicate and that kind of thing. So this void is not of the body, and it's not of the psyche. So we're not talking about altered states at all. We're not talking about consciousness. But consciousness is, you might say, up against something it doesn't know. It's an unknown factor. In my own case, it was something I'd never encountered before, had no idea, but it's very challenging and threatening to my consciousness, to my ego. And that's why I say it's very psychotic, very dramatic, very suicidal, as if the suicidal was almost a kind of reflection of the fact that that void was going to overcome the ego. So that is like a kind of suicide. I mean, if you go into the void, which I liken to death, so I think it's it's the death of the psychological ego. So on the psychological, psychic level, the psyche, consciousness, is coming up against something that's so powerful, so overwhelming, that the suicidal level was really my reaction to that void. So it was making me feel like I wanted to commit suicide, but that was simply, saying in another way that void would overcome the ego, and you would lose your ego, lose your identity, lose your security. And that was definitely there, a deep sense of insecurity and a deep sense of uncertainty, because I had no idea what was happening. It was absolutely alien to me. And then within a year, I went to India. And when I was in the Himalayas visiting Lama Govinda, that wrote a book called Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism, where I first read about the void, I visited him, and then I left him and went off into the Himalayas, walking around the temples and everything over several months. And I entered the void again, but more powerfully. It was so very, very powerful. And I felt like I was going to lose my identity, lose my memory, and just get swallowed up in the void, in this dark, deep, powerful energy, that I realised was the void. And I managed to be all right. Day by day by day, I felt I was going to lose my memory, lose my identity, etc. And eventually I came back to England. Now, while I was going through that condition in the Himalayas, I was doing some drawings, just spontaneously doing some drawings. And one of the drawings I did was of a young man who was naked to the waist, and then from the waist down, it was the tail of a serpent. Now, I'd read the Lama Govinda's book on Tibetan Buddhism, and I read about the void, and probably I read about the Kundalini, but I had no memory. I wasn't like thinking about that book or really dwelling on the book at all when I was walking around the Himalayas. But I may have picked up the idea of the Kundalini, etc. But anyway, I did this drawing, and I think it was related to the Kundalini, and that's been part of my life, the Kundalini. And I've studied my experiences in depth related to the Kundalini. But I've never practiced any meditation. I've never consciously awakened the Kundalini. It's just a process that's always been part of my life. And I've had what you call chakra awakenings, various chakra awakenings. So anyway, I came back to England after I'd experienced the void, and when I got back to England, like what happened before, the dark night of the soul, everything was light. I entered this extraordinary depth of silence. I just seemed to be in this silence, which is related to the void, but also related to the mind, the one mind. So when I was liberated, so to speak, and self-aware in the one mind, the term freedom came to me, and now this silence came to me as well. Very deep sense of silence, which was part of the void experience in the Himalayas. But this silence, so that when people came to see me to talk about India, I just remained very silent, literally almost unable to talk. And I just was in this state of absolute tranquility and peace. And again, a sense of freedom and independence. And then I actually went into a monastery, a Christian monastery, where I wanted to study mysticism. They had a library and I could study mysticism. And they were a silent order of monks. There was only 3 or 4 of them. So I spent about 5 months in that silent order in 1970 to 71. And then that was the year, 71, where I first went to visit Krishnamurti at the school. That's when I started going to the Krishnamurti talks. And when I first went into the tent to listen to him, and he started talking, I didn't need to listen to any of the words. I never, in all the years I went to Krishnamurti, what he said meant very little to me. But I did sense a certain presence with him. I did sense a certain relationship to myself immediately. I felt it. So I think we had something in common. I can't say exactly what it was. And one time I was sitting at the table near him, 2 places away from him, and my body became very light, I mean extremely light, almost levitating off the chair. I mean it's so light. And my whole nervous system, my whole body was like fluttering, just like the butterfly. Imagine the butterfly wings, or imagine the wind through the leaves. It just felt as absolutely light as a feather, and I was almost floating on the chair. That was the effect he had on me. And I think he had that same effect on himself. But that was another effect he had on me. So in the next talk I'll give tomorrow, I think I'll go into Krishnamurti's experience of the universal mind and what I think is happening to him there. So I'll do that tomorrow.